Hello, my name is Sharon Byrne and I'm the Early Years Development Coordinator with Barnardos, and I'll be presenting the webinar today, Supporting the Wellbeing of Children from Ukraine. And we'll be focusing on the impact of trauma and how to foster resilience in early learning and care. Now, we know the experience of war denies children a sense of safety and it puts a massive strain on their resilience. By combining the care and commitment you already show on a daily basis to all the children and families in your settings, with the information and strategies that we'll cover in today's webinar, you're going to be well on your way to making a lasting difference in children's lives. So working together, we know we can help families experiencing forced migration from Ukraine to recover from trauma and to regain some of that sense of security that many of them will have lost. A lot of the things we already do every day in early learning and care settings, like providing safe, predictable routines, helping children manage feelings and behaviours, and providing creative, sensory and physical activities, not only support children's healthy development, but also strengthen the capacity for resilience and recovery in young children who have experienced trauma. We know from research that early years educators are uniquely positioned to help families with young children as they cope with the effects of trauma. High quality early childhood education can be a powerful avenue for helping young refugee children manage their trauma and for supporting their well-being in the short and long term. So what do families need from early years educators? Well, families who've experienced forced migration, they need us to understand the impact of the experience of being displaced. They need us to understand the developmental effects of trauma and resettlement, and they need us to understand how to strengthen their children's capacity for resilience. So we're talking about trauma, but what do we actually mean when we say trauma? Well, individual trauma results from an event or series of events, or it could be a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, or spiritual well-being. Children in emergencies undergo psychological trauma from experiences such as the death or separation from family and friends, witnessing violence, losing their homes or being forced to flee from home, deprivation and discrimination. These traumatic events can have both immediate and long-lasting consequences across a range of different domains and to different degrees. Trauma that occurs during critical, sensitive periods of development, such as in early childhood, it's more likely to impact on a child's development, and it's known as developmental trauma. But trauma is really complex. There are many potentially traumatic incidents and situations that can affect children when growing up, in addition to those risk factors brought about as a result of war. And these are often known as adverse childhood experiences. And I'm sure many of you have heard that term before. And adverse childhood experiences, they're frequently interlinked and layered with one another. So it's really likely that many children from Ukraine, just like many children from Ireland, may have also in the past or currently are experiencing some of the adversities we're going to see in the slide here, in addition to the trauma caused by war. So when we mention adversities, this is a really useful framework. This is the Building Community Resilience framework. So in the top here where the tree is, when we're thinking about adversity and adverse childhood experiences, we're looking at those kind of adverse situations that children might be experiencing in their home. So things like parental mental health problems, parental separation or divorce, homelessness, domestic violence, physical and emotional neglect, emotional sexual abuse. Maybe there's parents with substance abuse problems. So they're those kind of adverse childhood experiences. But this also makes us think about adverse community environments. So we know that there's children living in poverty, facing discrimination, children living in unsafe neighborhoods. We know, for example, COVID-19 for many children, the pandemic was another adverse community environment. So we can see trauma is really complex. So we're thinking about all of these adverse childhood experiences, but we're also layering that with the trauma of war. So in relation to war-related risk factors, we know that the higher the dosage of trauma, the more serious the impact can be. So if we think about families arriving from Ukraine and we're thinking about what their experiences are, we know that for a child, how physically close the child was to the devastation of the war and the length of time that the child was directly exposed to those sights, smells, sounds of war, that's going to increase their risk for trauma. And then not only are we thinking about the child's physical proximity to the conflict, but we're also thinking about how psychologically close a child might be to the dangers of war. So in terms of how the war is impacting on their loved ones, and we know many children will have lost some of the most important people in their lives from either death or separation as a result of the war. And as early as educators, we all know the importance of a consistent daily routine in terms of children's well-being and their emotional security. And for children that have been impacted by war, their daily routine has just gone out the window. So that's been completely lost. And we know that many children and families have experienced a lack of basic needs. So there was periods of time when they didn't have enough adequate access to water, to food, to heat, to electricity, to medicine. So that's going to be an additional risk factor in terms of the traumatic impact. Children have lost homes, families, friends, community. Families have lost material possessions. And we know for many, the journey from their home to Ireland may have been fraught with danger, and that's going to cause a huge disruption to young lives. And then following their arrival in Ireland, they may face additional challenges. So they're just in the culture shock, getting used to the language difference, finding suitable accommodation for as long as they need it, and the ongoing separation from and the worry about family and friends that are still in Ukraine. So all of these factors are going to, increase the risk for trauma. So in terms of what trauma does to our brains and our body, so we know that learning how to cope with stress and adversity, that's a really important and completely normal part of healthy child development. And everybody feels stress from time to time. And when a young child experiences stressful situations and they've access to supportive relationships with the caring adults in their lives, the impact of this stress is really buffered. And this really helps to build a healthy stress response system. But when children are exposed to serious and/or prolonged exposure in early childhood to high levels of stress, such as the exposure to war, violence, neglect, or deprivation, without having adequate adult support, this causes what we call toxic stress. And toxic stress inhibits healthy development, and it increases the risk of stress-related lifelong repercussions. And the most effective prevention of toxic stress is to reduce the exposure of young children to extremely stressful conditions. And that's exactly what these families have done by removing their children from the conflict in Ukraine and coming to Ireland. And research shows that even under the most stressful conditions, supportive, responsive relationships with caring adults as early in life as possible can prevent and even reverse the damaging effects of toxic stress responses. And early learning and care plays an important role alongside the child's primary caregivers through the provision of caring and consistent relationships in centre and home-based settings. And we'll come back to the importance of relationships later on. So we've talked about the risk factors in terms of war. So now we're going to look at some of the protective factors too. So it's important to be kind of thinking in mind how the impact of trauma can be mitigated or buffered when children and families are able to stay together. And if children are able to maintain those secure attachment relationships with their primary caregivers, that's probably the most important protective factor. So that'd be one thing we'll be thinking about. And then we talked about how dosage really impacts in terms of trauma. So some families have been able to maybe avoid some of that chronic exposure to war and violence. So we're thinking about, you know, those families that maybe were not in the areas of Ukraine that were directly impacted by bombings, or were able to leave before they had that chronic exposure. We know that if children and families have had access continually to those basic necessities, that they'll do better. That families who've been able to migrate safely and felt secure in that journey. And we know that some children and families, maybe they were coming to Ireland, but they were meeting up with relatives from Ukraine that were living in Ireland. So that maybe made that journey feel more secure for them. And families that are able to maintain cultural and spiritual values and practices. So that's really important. That's considered a really important protective factor. And then, of course, having access to a strong support network. And when we're thinking about protective factors, we're also thinking about children's individual characteristics. So we're thinking about things like some children might naturally be skilled in language learning and it'll come to them a bit easier. Some children might be coming into your settings, and actually from their own early positive experiences, they might have really high self-esteem, might be really good problem solvers, might be really good self-regulation skills. So like they're all going to be really good protective factors for those children. So we know war and forced migration can teach children that nowhere is safe, that things can change at any time, that people are capable of terrible cruelty. And it can also teach children that they have no control and that their parents have no control. And we know from research that there's clear links between trauma and adversity in childhood and an increased likelihood of poor physical and psychological health, academic and well-being outcomes later in life. So that's why it's really important that we understand the impact of trauma. But how might trauma present itself in children who are starting in your settings in the here and now? So young children are particularly vulnerable to the impact of stressors. And we mentioned toxic stress earlier on. Toxic stress can harm the brain, of course, at any point in development. But when it happens early, the impacts, they're just really more profound. Young children who experience trauma see the world as a dangerous place, and their stress response systems are continually activated, communicating to them that they're not safe. So what does that mean? Well, it means that for children who've experienced trauma and toxic stress, even though they might be attending your service and you might have an absolutely gorgeous service, you might have really thought about how you're going to make the environment safe and welcoming. You might have a service with really kind and caring adults, beautiful environments, and you've really thought about the routines. And even with all of those things in place, some children might really struggle and become overwhelmed very easily because of the result of trauma. Their brains get wired on what we call hyper alert, with the result that they're experiencing the world as unsafe, and as a very dangerous place, even though you might have a really lovely and very safe and high quality service. So when I mentioned there about stress responses and how stress might present itself in the here and now. So what we're talking here is around some stress responses, or sometimes you might hear them being called survival responses. So they're your fight, flight, and freeze behaviors. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard of fight, flight, and freeze behaviors. So when we're thinking about fight behaviors, we're thinking about things like a child that's maybe hitting and kicking a lot, a child that's very angry, maybe demanding, controlling, or yelling and screaming a lot, finding it very hard to stay at activities, maybe throwing and breaking toys. So those kind of fight behaviors. And then when we're thinking about flight behaviors, we're thinking about a child that maybe is constantly running away from caregivers, maybe hiding under tables, maybe always wanting or needing to be in the line first, bumping into others, constantly wants to leave the room every time the door is open, maybe they're gone. A child with really high activity levels. And then the third one, we think about freeze, and sometimes the freeze behaviors are the ones that might go under the radar a little bit more. But that's a child that maybe kind of comes across very withdrawn, maybe looks like they're daydreaming a lot, or kind of looks sleepy. They might be unresponsive to questions, or maybe you're calling their name and they're not responding. Might be engaging in a lot of those kind of repetitive movements. A child that's very quiet, a child that maybe has a kind of a blank look on their face. So they're the kind of stress responses we might see in children. But of course, all or any of these behaviors doesn't necessarily mean that the child has been traumatized. So just to be getting, what we're really saying is to try and be curious about behavior. I mean, of course, some of these behaviors, they might be as a result of a child's developmental stage. It might be a child's temperament or their disposition. Or it could be, so for example, when we think about a child that kind of is very quiet, well, we know when a child is learning, for example, English as a second language, that there's often that silent period. So that wouldn't necessarily indicate that the child is having a stress response. So that might be just a perfectly typical stage in their development of second language behavior. So what we're really talking about is those behaviors that you find as an early years educator very worrying, that maybe you're seeing it happening very frequently during the day, and it's happening for long periods, and you're not seeing any obvious triggers for these behaviors. They're the kind of things where we start to think about, you know, getting curious about behavior and thinking about, could this be a stress response that I'm seeing? So you see here on the slide, this is the window of tolerance. And the window of tolerance is a concept developed by Dr. Dan Siegel. And it's really, really helpful to get us to kind of really understand that the zone of what we call like that kind of emotional and physical arousal in which we can function in everyday life. So we all, every single one of us has our own individual window of tolerance. And when we're in this zone, that means we can reflect, we can think clearly, make rational decisions, we can learn, we can manage our emotions, and we don't feel overwhelmed. And in terms of children, when they're in their window of tolerance, they can play, they can explore and learn and socialize, they can use words, they can make friends. So that's all thinking about a child that's feeling regulated. So we call that their window of tolerance. Now, when children feel pushed out of their window of tolerance. So when we talked earlier on about those stress responses, the fight, flight, and freeze. So when children are having one of them stress responses, so they've been triggered, and we'll talk a little about triggering in a second, what happens is they can feel pushed out of their window of tolerance. And sometimes they get pushed out and they kind of move to the above the window, and that's those fight and flight behaviors, or they can get pushed out the window and into the underneath the window, and we'll call that they're those freeze behaviors that we talked about earlier. So knowing that each child has their own unique window of tolerance, it really helps us to understand the behavior of a stressed child. And some children, particularly if they have a kind of hyper alert stress response as a result of toxic stress, they can have a very small window of tolerance. And so they're easily triggered by certain situations. So, you know, things like certain smells, maybe, or sounds or touch, or we might be triggered by events in the morning. So maybe when their parent is leaving the setting in the morning, that might be very triggering and they get pushed very easily out of their window. Or maybe sleep time for some children, that can be really stressful and it's bringing up past trauma for them. So really our job as early years educators is to help children to stay in their window of tolerance. So when they feel pushed out of the window, we can be there for them. We can really try and help to regulate and help them feel calm and help them feel safe so they can return to their window. And over time, what we're hoping to do is to support them to build those regulation skills so that their window becomes larger and that they can cope with everyday little stresses. And how we do this is by helping to foster the resilience. So the first stage to recovery from trauma, from any type of trauma, is the establishment of safety. And so we have to prioritize this. When children start in our service, that's our first thing we're going to do. We're going to try and help that child to feel safe in our service. But once that's established, then the real kind of next step, if you like, is to help children who've been impacted by war and trauma, is to help kind of foster their resilience. So we're going to be really trying to help children to make their windows of tolerance bigger. And we know the return to early learning and care is a really important symbol of recovery and resilience to children and their parents. And it helps to restore a sense of normalcy, and it gives families that sense of kind of those feelings of hope and efficacy. And once we have that safety established and children's basic needs are met, so we're going to be thinking about how to promote their resilience. So what do we mean by resilience? Well, resilience is the ability to thrive, to adapt and cope despite difficult and stressful times. The more resilient a child is, the more likely they are to deal with stressful situations in a healthy way that won't have those prolonged negative outcomes. And sometimes we hear about, oh, children are really resilient, and we kind of just make presumptions, but actually resilience is not an innate characteristic. We're not just born resilient. So resilience is something that's built over time, but it is a skill that can be taught, it can be learned, and it can be practiced. And resilience, it's important to say, resilience does not mean the trauma of war goes away, but it can help that traumatized person to learn to live with the traumatic memories without being overwhelmed by them. And also, a trauma survivor can be resilient and still be impacted by their trauma. But everyone has the ability to become resilient when they're surrounded by the right environments and they're surrounded by the right people. So the better an early years educator understands the impact of trauma and the signs of resilience, the more they'll be able to effectively promote resilience. So this webinar today, we're just giving you a little taster. We do have more in-depth training available for people if they are interested in learning a little bit more about trauma and resilience. And we know that early learning and care services that foster resilience, what they'll do is they'll make sure that their practice isn't just limited to focusing on children's risks and their vulnerabilities, but they're providing a more optimistic framework. So they're working towards positive outcomes for children, and they're thinking about all those positive influences that foster resilience. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start to look at some of those key considerations that help to foster resilience in children and families that are arriving from Ukraine and that they're starting in our early years services. So the first one, and this is really, really key, is that transition into the service. So that's settling in period. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole kind of settling in process because like you know them already. You're settling in children like all of the time, I'm sure, in your services, and particularly maybe at those kind of September times. So all of those things that you're doing already, like to keep doing them, you know, to be really mindful around them. But so I'm just going to touch on a few of them today. So the first one here, be friendly, particularly when there is a language barrier there, and there will be for many families. It's so important to remember to greet a family with a smile. A warm greeting helps families to feel welcomed and valued, and it can really set people at ease. And for you as an educator, not only to be friendly, but to be confident as well when you're talking, because that's going to help parents feel confident. Learn to use, learn parents' names and children's names, but also learn the proper pronunciation of those names. We know the settling in period is just so important for all children, and it's really key to have that key person, and we'll be coming back in a little while to talk a bit more about a key person approach. But having a key person taking the lead in that settling in time, that's going to support a child's first transition into the setting and really try and help them feel more secure in the setting and bring about that sense of belonging. So the child's key person, as I said, should be the one to take the lead in supporting children and families making that transition. And really important here, try and do a very gradual separation between the child and parent. So what I mean by that is that gradually increasing the length of separations between the parent and child as the child becomes more comfortable in the setting. And this is particularly important for families who've experienced trauma. And it involves working with the parents and the child to plan for those separations ahead of time. And we know that children and parents who've experienced severe trauma, they'll have often got what we call extreme separation anxiety. But of course, every child's different, and it's important also just to say not to rush it. So sometimes we might have our settling in policy, and we might say, oh, well, we do settling in over a period of a week, or we do settling in over a period of 2 weeks. But it's just a thing, separations can take longer than those kind of 1 or 2 weeks. It can take like maybe many, many weeks. And if you try and rush it, if it's done too quickly, what you can do is you can kind of re-traumatize children in terms of that separation and cause more anxiety and make it even more difficult for children and parents to develop trust. And in terms of communication, particularly, like, it's going to be very likely that a lot of families, there will be a language barrier. So it's really important that we don't overwhelm the family with too much information. If you can, provide information and materials that are maybe translated to the family's home language if you can, or written materials that are written in plain English and using visuals. So you maybe have a parent handbook and you kind of review that and make sure it's very plain English. Show parents around, just like you would do, I would hope, for all families. And I know that a lot of people have found those translation apps really useful. So if you don't have a person that's available to translate, and a lot of times you won't have, that maybe those translation apps can be helpful in the right circumstances. And we know that even if you were speaking to a parent in their home language, or if the parent did have English as a second language, they might still have difficulty processing the information you're sharing with them, because we know trauma and stress can reduce a person's ability to absorb new information. And to help build a relationship, you can ask about maybe their child's likes or interests. So you might say, what does Anton like to play with? That's a kind of nice, straightforward kind of opener. You might follow up, might give a few choices. Maybe you're showing them around and you're asking them, do they like blocks or the jigsaws, or, they like playing outside, for example. So you're giving a few props to help. But just important to remember, if there's too much talking, then families might stop listening and might stop trying to understand altogether. So, and they might even start to avoid you if you're causing them stress when they've difficulties maybe understanding. So, and the last one there, just to be very sensitive about the information that you're asking parents at this time. And yes, sometimes it is helpful to know some of that background information so we can help support the parent and the child, but that might be something that has to be built up over time as you build trust. So just to be sensitive about that. Have a look at the forms, think about the questions you're asking people and think about, can I gather some of this information over a period of time? And just kind of focus on the necessary for now. And also, I know to think, be sensitive in terms of what requests are made to parents. So I know like a lot of settings maybe ask parents to bring in certain types of food. You might be asking parents to bring in, wellies or spare clothes or other extra things for their child. And some families mightn't have the money to do that, or they mightn't know where to buy these certain requests. So just to remember to be sensitive around that too. And also the last thing, we know that maybe their circumstances might change very quickly. So for example, they might move accommodation. So just to let parents know, they can update you anytime, and maybe, you check in with them, from time to time in terms of that information. And really key, and I've mentioned kind of key person there and relationships, but we know that resilience is built through social connections. Children's connection or attachment to caring adults really does provide the best protection against trauma. People who have strong connections with their family and friends and close social supports are so much better able to get help during difficult times. Studies have even shown that children's loss and separation from their primary caregivers is even more damaging to children's social and emotional development than threats to their physical safety, such as what we see in wartime. So the availability of trusted and available adults in young children's lives provides children with feelings of safety and security, and is the most protective factor in a young child's life. So, as we said, all children need healthy relationships, but this is particularly true for children who've experienced trauma. When people are in stressful and dangerous situations, they typically, the first thing they do is turn to people that they trust for help. And as we talked about earlier, for children who've experienced toxic stress, their systems can be on hyper alert, and they can move straight into those fight, flight, or freeze responses during situations that we as adults might seem relatively minor. So we want to support children to stay regulated during these times. And the main way we do this is through the power of relationships. So I know many settings have a key person approach. And if you don't have one already in place, if you can, think we have, like in Barnardos, we have a free booklet around key person approach, and we have a free webinar up there online too for people who want to know more. But a key person approach is the ideal setup in an early learning and care service. It's when each child in the setting has a key person that supports that child and their family when they're first settling into the setting, but also continues the relationship on during the time in the setting. And this really helps that child to feel secure, and it brings about a sense of connection and belonging. So it's the child's key person who has a special responsibility of getting to know that child really well and for planning to help meet that child's needs. So we see here, be the secure base. And what does that mean? Well, it's all about letting children know you're there for them by watching over them, playing with them, offering them encouragement. And this really helps the child to feel more secure in the setting. And it's going to help to give them the confidence to be able to explore their new surroundings, to make friends and to play. And when we're thinking about being the safe haven, this is equally important. It means being available for children when they're feeling stressed, to be able to offer them comfort and protection, to help them to regulate their feelings. And at first, we know children mightn't go to you when they're feeling overwhelmed. So you need to go to them. You need to make those extra efforts to let children know you see them, you hear them, and you are there for them. So when we're that key person, we're really trying to build those secondary attachments. So it's equally important that we are the secure base and that we're their safe haven while they're in the service. And as we're all very well aware in early learning and care, play is one of the most important aspects of children's lives. And the provision of play opportunities is going to be an essential feature in all early childhood settings. And a key aspect of play is children's own agency. So they should have control over the play experience. In play, children should be able to act independently and make their own free choices. Play can help children cope by providing a way for them to work through their thoughts and feelings, and it's helping them make sense of their traumatic experiences. But children who have experienced trauma can have some real difficulties in play because of those stress responses, those fight, flight, and freeze behaviors that we talked about earlier. And they can be easily triggered by different situations that can come up in play. So, for example, maybe a conflict with another child, maybe a child taking their toy away, for example, that can be, lead to a stress response. Or maybe children might be replaying or reliving traumas through their play. And how we can support children by staying close, by helping children to stay regulated, and by supporting them in terms of their problem solving skills. And then I'm moving on to the physical environment. So you're thinking your physical learning environment in your earlier setting can make such a big difference in how children feel in a space. It can help children to feel calm, safe, and welcome, but it can have the opposite effect too, and trigger feelings of anxiety, fear, and danger. And as we looked at earlier, children who are traumatized, they tend to constantly scan their environment for threat. So what they see, hear, smell, and touch, they can become triggers. It can be very activating. So they might really struggle if they're in a very busy environment with lots of stimulation. And we know early learning care environments typically are very stimulating places to be because they're designed to promote children's learning and development. So we really have to think very hard about what sensory related triggers might be occurring in the environment and triggering stress responses. So, for example, maybe there's loud noises, like maybe you do a fire alarm. So you might be thinking that could be very triggering for a child, and how might I do that in a different way? Or maybe the noise of a door slamming, for example, or raised voices of adults. These can all be, not for all children, but for some children, they can be potentially traumatizing. So what I'd advise you to do is to, if you can, to take a walk around your setting, walk around the whole setting, put yourself in the child's shoes and see what would it be like if I was a child arriving from a war-torn area, having been possibly traumatized by my experiences and arriving into my service and having a look. And so sometimes it gives you an opportunity to reflect on how the child might be experiencing the setting. Also thinking about the importance of outdoor play. And do children have access to outdoor play throughout the day? Because we know the outdoor area offers children loads of opportunities to regulate. So through gross motor movements, for example, a lot of children find that very regulating. So things like swinging and climbing, and hanging from monkey bars. In outdoor play as well, there's less pressure on children in terms of their language skills. So that's another bonus. And also with thinking about access to nature. So thinking about, is there natural kind of environments in your outdoor play, natural features, because we know from research that nature improves well-being and helps to make people feel calmer. And we'll be thinking about things like creating safe and cozy spaces that are calming for children. So thinking about, have you got space in your service indoors and outdoors to find those kind of cozy spaces, where you might put some of those sensory materials in and maybe some soft materials in, where children who are feeling overwhelmed can go to help them to calm down. And they might need the support of the adult in terms of being able to do that. So it's not about leaving them alone to regulate, but just giving that space that they might choose to do that when they're starting to feel overwhelmed. And then we know that children arriving from Ukraine may have experienced chaotic and unpredictable circumstances with little sense of control over their daily lives. So a stable and predictable, and of course, flexible daily routine is going to offer many benefits for children, but especially children who've been exposed to trauma. When children know the order of events in a day and how they're going to be carried out. It helps them to gain a sense of safety in the setting because they can predict what's coming next. So it does help a child to feel safe and secure. And we know it's only when children feel safe that they're going to be able to explore their environment and make friends and learn. So things like, and I'm sure many of you have these in place already, but things like having a routine chart with photos of the children and the adults in your service, and you can see maybe the different parts of the day on it. That's going to be really helpful for children. And the most important part of the day will be the arrivals. So for children and parents who've experienced a traumatic loss of loved ones, they might be particularly, as we said earlier, particularly triggered when they're separating at arrival times. So it's really important. We don't want to see arrival times as a dropping off time. We want to see it as the most important part of the day. And so that means welcoming parents all the way into the child's room, being warm and friendly, but also confident. As we said earlier, we're going to help parents to feel more confident. So what you're doing is you're trying to aim to help the child at arrival time to feel that sense of belonging and connection. So instead of what sometimes we do, we might focus on telling the child, oh, it's okay, your mom's going to be back soon. She's just gone to the shops or whatever. She won't be too long. Instead of doing that, what we really want to do is let the children know that you're there for them, that you're going to take care of them, you're going to keep them safe. So they're not having to kind of hold on to all of these fears until their parent comes back, that they have you in the meantime to care for them. And then your routine also should provide for those activities that are enjoyable, that they're interesting for children, and I'm sure you have this in place already. And also thinking about, you know, how they support children in discovering those activities that promote regulation and calmness, because that's going to be different for different children. So again, back to the key person again, being able to really get to know the child very well, being able to observe individual children to see, is there associations between certain activities and materials that they use and a child feeling safe and happy? And if we can see that, we might provide for these activities. So you might notice a child likes to maybe hold small toys in their hand, or they might spend a long time playing with the sand, or they love playing outside. So if you kind of get to know the child really well, then maybe you're able to provide for these activities during the day to help a child to stay regulated. And then lastly, transitions, and they can be stressful for a lot of children, but particularly stressful for children that have been traumatized. So moving from one part of the daily routine to the next, it can really trigger feelings of anxiety, distress, and those feelings of being kind of a loss of control. So some transitions we know during the day, they're inevitable, can't be avoided, but it's important to keep the number of transitions to a minimum as much as you can, and plan those transitions in advance. So you've got kind of, you know, different strategies to help you to minimize that stress. So, you know, things like tidy up time, maybe you sing the same song every day to indicate that it's nearly tidy up time. So all of those transition kind of plans you already have in place are going to be even more important. And sometimes if it's not the beginning of the year, and maybe most of the children in your service are already really well settled, sometimes some of those great kind of plans we have in place to help children kind of might go out the window when it gets to later in the year. But when we have children that are only coming in for the first time, you know, in maybe April, May, June even, it's really important to be, you know, remembering that they are the types of strategies that are helpful for all children. And in terms of family engagement, we know the whole family will have been impacted by the trauma of war. And this can have a really detrimental impact on a parent's mental health. And they're probably very likely to be very worried about family members who have remained in the in the Ukraine. And that will include partners, maybe elderly parents, and other relatives. So parents and caregivers themselves might be very anxious. They might have difficulty sleeping. They might be finding it very hard to focus. Some parents might be suffering with post-traumatic stress disorder, and they might need some professional supports. And we know the impact of trauma on parents can in turn, it can really influence their parenting practices. So it might make it much harder for a parent to be able to provide all the emotional support that their child needs. When we're thinking about even the term family, we're really referring to all of those that are directly providing for the child's care. So a lot of children who've arrived from Ukraine, they might not be in the care of their parents. Instead, they might be cared for by older siblings or by other family members, such as their grandparents, their aunts, their uncles, maybe their cousins. So we need to be careful not to make assumptions about the identities of different people and their relationships to each other. And parents and other family members who are still in Ukraine, they might want, very likely might want to stay involved in their child's life. So ask the family, how can you support this? So maybe you can support this through, use of photos. Maybe it can be texting or emailing. Maybe you can record videos that can be shared to family members at home. So just ask. And we know that experiences of trauma can often leave parents feeling very powerless. So it's really important to recognize all parents have the right to have a say in matters that affect them and their children. Let parents know that you see them as the expert on their child, and try and focus on what parents are already doing well, because this is going to really help in terms of building trust between you and the parent. And share information and offer supports where you can. So for example, maybe on aspects of child development, so you might be sharing about the importance of a parent using the home language at home. So that might be one example. Or you might be sharing information on local amenities in the community. So particularly with a family coming from Ukraine, they're maybe not going to know where the local primary schools are, where things like the dentist or the library is, so where the parks are. So you might be sharing information around the neighborhood too. And then also, if it's needed, you might want to share information on targeted support. So if that's needed. So for example, around, child psychology services, or maybe access to parenting courses in the community. So this is our last slide here. And it's just really important to remember when we're working with young children, yes, it's a very rewarding and meaningful profession, but there's the huge emotional demands that come with the role. And this is especially true when we care for children who've experienced trauma, because it can leave us feeling drained, overwhelmed, and then susceptible to stress ourselves. So this is why it's so important. We have to prioritize our well-being so that we can feel resourced and build our own resilience. It's only when we're feeling calm and regulated that we're going to be able to support a distressed child to feel calm and regulated too. So you can't pour from an empty cup. Take care of yourself first. It's so, so important. So I'm going to finish up now. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this webinar. And if you're interested in accessing more information, we have some resources available. So just go on to the Barnardos website and you'll see some tip sheets, and we have some written publications too. And we also deliver training on the topic of trauma awareness. So feel free to check back in, and thank you very much.